The gate agent scanned my ticket and shook her head before she even said the words. Ma'am, this flight is closed. The door closed 4 minutes ago. I was still holding my boarding pass. Porto, Portugal. Seat 14C. My family was already on that plane, 40 feet away on the other side of a wall of glass. And my passport was gone from the front pocket of my bag where I had checked it 3 times that morning. I called my mother. It rang twice and went to voicemail. I called my aunt. Same thing. I stood at that window and watched a plane push back from the gate with my entire family on it. And I told myself there had been a mistake, that someone would call me back in 5 minutes laughing about a mix-up. Nobody called me back that day. What I didn't know yet, standing there with an empty passport pocket and a boarding pass that meant nothing, was that 3 hours later a supervisor at the passport office would look at her screen, go quiet, and ask me a question that didn't make any sense. She asked me if I was sure I hadn't already left the country, because according to her system, I had. Welcome back to Quiet Proof Stories, where the people who kept the paperwork always end up holding the truth. I'm Naomi. If you've ever been the responsible one in your family, the one who reads the fine print while everyone else just wants to get to dessert, stay with me, because this story is for you. Drop a comment and subscribe, because you are going to want to see how this ends. To understand how I ended up alone at a gate in New York while my family flew to Portugal without me, you have to understand who I was in that family long before any of this happened. I'm a trade compliance analyst. I spent 9 years learning how to read documents other people skim, shipping manifests, customs declarations, certificates of origin. My whole job is noticing the one line that doesn't match the rest of the page. It is not a glamorous skill. Nobody reads paperwork carefully on a toast at a wedding. But it is the skill that ended up saving my family's house. And it is the same skill that, months later, would end up exposing them. I grew up close to my father's mother, my grandmother Isabel. She came to the United States from Porto in 1968 with 2 suitcases and a sewing machine. And by the time I was born, she had a small tailoring business, a modest house in New Jersey, and the house she never sold back home, a narrow blue house on a hill above the Douro River that had belonged to her own mother. Every summer of my childhood, my father took me to Porto for 3 weeks. We ate lunch on that terrace. My grandmother taught me to make bread and to speak enough Portuguese to argue with the fish market vendors. My Aunt Rita, my father's younger sister, came exactly twice in all those years. My cousin Paige, Rita's daughter, came once, when she was 6, and cried the whole time about the lack of Wi-Fi. My father died 10 years ago. A heart attack at 51. Sudden, no warning. I was 26. I was the one who flew to Porto that spring to sit with my grandmother while she buried her only son. Because Rita said the timing was terrible for her. She had a work event she couldn't move. I was the one who spent the next 4 years calling my grandmother every Sunday, translating her hospital paperwork over the phone when her hip replacement went sideways, wiring money quietly when our heating bill came in high one winter, and she was too proud to ask her daughter. None of that was a complaint at the time. It was just what I did. I have since learned that in families like mine, the person who quietly does the work is rarely the person who gets remembered as having done it. In the eyes of Portuguese inheritance law, and in the eyes of my grandmother's will, my father's death meant I stepped into his place, not as a favor, as a matter of law. When my grandmother passed away 8 months ago, at 89, in her sleep, in that same blue house, her estate split 2 ways. My grandmother had 2 children, my father, Peter, and my Aunt Rita. My father was gone, so under the will, and under Portuguese succession law, his one-half share of the estate passed to me. Rita got the other half. That made me a 50% owner of a house on a hill above the Douro River that neither Rita nor I had grown up wanting to sell. Except Rita wanted to sell it. Fast. I found out how fast about 3 weeks after the funeral, on a phone call I still have saved, because by then I had already started saving things. There's a hotel group interested, Rita said. Vinduro Hospitality. They want the whole block for a boutique property. They're offering 2.4 million euros for the house. Split down the middle. That's real money, Naomi. That's life-changing money. I asked who had done the appraisal. Their people did, she said. Like that answered the question instead of raising it. I want to be honest about who I am in a family conflict, because I think it matters for the rest of this story. I did not say no. I did not accuse anyone of anything. I am not a person who leads with suspicion. I am a person who asks for a second opinion, in writing, and waits. I hired my own appraiser. His name was Grant Foster, a certified valuator who worked with international property and had handled a dispute for a colleague of mine 2 years earlier. It took him 5 weeks, because European property records move slowly and he wanted to do it right. When his report came back, I read it twice. The way I read everything twice. Grant walked me through it over a video call, screen sharing 3 comparable sales from the same hillside in the last 2 years, none of which Vinduro's original number had accounted for. He'd also pulled the municipal planning register, the kind of document most people never think to check, and found that the city had quietly reclassified the block 18 months earlier to allow boutique hospitality use. The exact zoning a hotel developer would need, and the exact reason a developer would want the block badly enough to move fast. Someone advising Rita already knew that. It was written into the developer's internal offer memo. One line buried on page 4. A detail Rita's own realtor should have flagged to her and hadn't. The house, the terrace, and the small guest house behind it, together, with the location factored in, the river view, and that rezoning, were worth closer to 3.9 million euros, not 2.4. Nearly 60% more. I called Rita and told her, calmly, that we needed a second, truly independent appraisal before anyone signed anything. There was a long pause on the line. Then she laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh. Naomi, you've turned this into a business deal. Your grandmother is barely in the ground, and you're negotiating like it's a warehouse contract. I'm making sure we don't sell a nearly 4 million euro house for 2.4, I said. That's not negotiating. That's arithmetic. It's family, she said. You don't do arithmetic with family. I would hear that line, or some version of it, a dozen more times over the next 2 months. From Rita. From my cousin Paige, who called me difficult in a text to my mother that my mother, for reasons of her own, forwarded to me by accident. From my mother herself, who had never once in my life used the phrase generational wealth until Rita started using it in front of her. The story shifted, week by week, from let's honor grandma's wishes to your grandmother would want the family to be flexible to, finally, the version one heard the week before the trip. You're the one holding this up, Naomi. Everyone else is ready to sign. It's just you. There was one dinner, about a month before the trip, that I think about often now. My mother had invited everyone to her apartment, and I remember thinking, walking in, that the table was set the way it used to be set for holidays, like the occasion mattered more than a Tuesday should. Rita brought a bottle of wine and a printout of the developer's offer letter, laid out on the counter like a menu. Gary talked about market timing for 20 minutes, a phrase he clearly liked the sound of. Paige mostly looked at her phone. Somewhere between the salad and the pasta, Rita set down her fork and looked at me the way you look at someone you're about to correct in public. Can I ask you something? Honestly, do you even want the house, Naomi? Or do you just want to be the one who decides what happens to it? I told her I wanted a fair number before anyone signed anything, and that those were not the same question. Everything is a fair number to you, she said. That's the problem. Some things aren't supposed to be measured that precisely. Your grandmother didn't raise a house. She raised a family. I didn't say what I was thinking, which was that my grandmother had, in fact, very precisely raised a house. She kept the original deed, the tax receipts, and every renovation invoice in a labeled folder in her closet for 60 years. Because she told me once that a woman who doesn't keep her own paperwork ends up owning nothing at all. I wish I had said it out loud that night. I said it, eventually, to a courtroom instead. It was not, in fact, just me. Grant Foster's report existed. The zoning change existed. I had emailed both to Rita, to my mother, and to Rita's lawyer in Porto 3 separate times. Nobody argued with the numbers. They just stopped mentioning them and started, instead, mentioning me. The trip was Rita's idea, presented as a gift. One last family trip to Grandma's house, she said, before it's not ours anymore. We'll do the notary signing while we're there, all together, the way she would have wanted. My mother thought it sounded lovely. Paige posted a countdown on her phone's lock screen. I said yes, because despite everything, I did want to stand on that terrace one more time, and because if we were going to sign anything, I intended to be in the room when it happened, reading every line myself. The night before we flew out, my partner Theo found me at the kitchen table laying out photocopies of Grant's report next to the original offer letter, lining up the numbers one more time out of habit. He sat down across from me the way he does when he can tell I'm circling something I haven't said out loud yet. You don't have to go, he said. You could tell them to send you the final numbers. Sign from a lawyer's office here. Skip the whole production. I told him I wanted to be in the room. I wanted to watch the notary read the number out loud. Watch Rita's face when it was the real number and not the discounted one. And I wanted, honestly, one more afternoon on the terrace before it stopped being ours. He didn't argue. He just said, then take pictures of everything before you leave the house tomorrow. All of it. Every page. I laughed and told him he was being paranoid. I packed the folder in the front pocket of my carry-on that night, next to my passport, and I did not take a single picture because I still believed, at 11 o'clock that night, that the worst thing waiting for me on this trip was an uncomfortable conversation about money. I should tell you now, because you deserve to know what I did that night. The plan was never for me to sign anything in that room. The plan was for me to never make it to that room at all. 10 days before the flight, I got a text from Paige that I didn't think twice about at the time. Hey, random Q, but what size are your jeans? Lol, asking for a friend. I told her I wore a 6. She sent back a laughing emoji and nothing else. I want you to hold on to that text because it will matter again in about 11 minutes. 4 days before the flight, Rita called my mother, not me, and offered to handle the airport logistics since we were all going together anyway. My mother mentioned it to me almost as an afterthought. Rita's booked us a car service to JFK. Isn't that generous? I said that was fine. I had no reason to think a car service was a weapon. The morning of the flight, we all met at my mother's apartment before the car came. I had my passport in the zippered front pocket of my carry-on. I checked it in the kitchen, the way I check everything, because that is who I am. Rita hugged me longer than usual at the door. We're so glad you're coming, she said into my shoulder. And I remember thinking it was a strange thing to say to someone who was, obviously, already coming. At JFK, we checked bags together, went through the ticket counter together. And then Rita suggested we split into 2 security lines, so we all get through faster, steering Paige and herself into one line and gesturing my mother and me into another, 20 feet away. It felt ordinary. Airports make you do ordinary, senseless things like that all the time. I put my carry-on on the belt. I put my jacket in a bin. On the other side of the metal detector, I reached for my bag, unzipped the front pocket out of habit to make sure my passport had survived the X-ray, and it wasn't there. I want to describe exactly what that felt like, because I think most people who haven't lost a passport in an airport underestimate it. It is not panic right away. It is disbelief. You unzip the pocket a second time, as if the passport might have simply become invisible and would reappear on the third try. You check every other pocket, the ones you know it isn't in, Because your hands need something to do while your brain refuses the information. I checked my jacket. I checked the outer pocket where I keep gum. I dumped the entire bag onto a bench in the middle of TSA and knelt on the floor of JFK sorting through receipts and hand sanitizer while my mother stood over me saying, "It has to be there. Naomi, it has to be there," in a voice that, looking back, sounded less like worry and more like a woman narrating a scene she already knew the ending of. It was not there. A TSA officer named Officer Blake, who had watched me empty the bag twice, crouched down and helped me check the seams of the lining. The kind of thing you do for a stranger having a bad morning. Rita and Paige stood at the edge of the checkpoint the whole time, close enough to hear everything, and Rita called out, once, "Do you want us to hold your seat?" A question that, at the time, sounded like kindness, and that I would later understand was Rita checking whether I still believed I had a seat to hold. I called TSA Lost and Found. I called the airline. My mother offered to go find Rita, which struck me even then as an odd errand, since Rita was one security line over and could see us the entire time and had not once walked over to help. Boarding started. I told my mother to go, that I would sort this out and catch a later flight once I found the passport or got an emergency one issued, that there was no reason for all of us to miss the trip. She looked at me for a second too long before she nodded and walked toward the gate. I remember that pause. I didn't understand it then. I understand it now. I watched my whole family disappear down that jet bridge. My mother, my Aunt Rita, my cousin Paige, who did not once look back. The doors closed. The plane pushed back 40 minutes later while I sat on a bench outside security filling out a lost item report with Officer Blake, who was kind and tired and had clearly filled out this exact form 1,000 times before. He asked me the standard questions: when I last seen it, whether I'd checked my check bag, whether anyone else had handled my carry-on that morning. I told him no, not that I knew of, and I meant it, because I still hadn't put together that 11 seconds on an X-ray belt is more than enough time for a hand that knows exactly what it's looking for. That should have been the whole story. A woman loses her passport, misses a flight, feels foolish, gets an emergency travel document, flies out 2 days later. Families lose things at airports every single day, except nobody called to check on me. Not that night, not the next morning. I texted my mother once the plane had landed in Lisbon. "Let me know you all made it. Still working on the passport situation here." And got back a single thumbs up emoji 4 hours later. Rita didn't text at all. Paige posted a photo from the terrace that evening, my grandmother's terrace, captioned home. And I remember staring at it for a long time, feeling something I couldn't quite name yet, somewhere between hurt and suspicion. The way you feel when a room goes quiet in a way that doesn't match the occasion. But that afternoon, when I finally got an appointment at the regional passport agency in Manhattan to apply for an emergency passport, the woman behind the counter, her name tag said R. Alvarez, typed my information into her system, went still, and then typed it again, slower. "Ma'am," she said, "can I ask you to confirm your date of birth and your passport number one more time?" I did. She looked at her screen, then at me, then back at the screen. "According to our system," she said carefully, "your passport was used to exit the United States this morning. Departure recorded at approximately 10:50 a.m. Outbound flight to Lisbon with a connection to Porto." I told her that was impossible, that I was standing in her office in Manhattan at 4 in the afternoon, that I had never boarded that flight. "I believe you," she said, and I could tell she meant it, because she wasn't looking at me like a confused traveler anymore. She was looking at me like a problem that belonged to someone else's department. "But somebody's face went through that exit control this morning under your passport number, and it wasn't you standing here." She picked up a phone and made a call using words I'd never heard applied to my own life before. Possible document fraud. Possible identity substitution. and told me a specialist would be in touch. I sat in a molded plastic chair in a government office in Manhattan and understood, for the first time, that I had not simply lost a passport. Someone had used it. Someone had walked through a border with my name and my number, and, apparently, a face that the machines had accepted as mine. If you've ever had that feeling, the floor tilting sideways because the fact you were certain of turns out to be wrong, stay with me, because it only gets stranger from here. Comment below if you've ever caught your own family in a lie you didn't want to believe. 2 days passed before the Diplomatic Security Service called. That's the branch of the State Department that investigates passport and visa fraud. Something I had never needed to know before that Thursday. The agent's name was Priya Reyes, a 12-year veteran of the agency who told me, plainly, that most of her cases involved strangers stealing identities, not families. She was polite, direct, and asked me questions I didn't have good answers to yet. Who had access to my bag that morning? Who had handled the car service booking? Whether anyone in my family resembled me closely enough to pass a quick visual check at a gate. While her office worked the federal side, I did the only thing I know how to do when the ground shifts under me. I built a file. It's the same instinct that makes me a good compliance analyst. When a shipment doesn't match its paperwork, you don't argue about it. You document your own version of events until the two accounts can be laid side by side. I pulled my phone's location history, which placed me at JFK until 1 in the afternoon, and then in Manhattan by 3. I pulled a credit card charge from a coffee shop near the passport office, time-stamped 2:41 that afternoon. I pulled my building's key fob log, which showed me leaving my apartment for the airport that morning and nothing else until I badged back in that night. Alone. None of it was dramatic. All of it, together, was an airtight answer to a question I never thought I would need to answer. Prove you didn't leave the country you never left. I thought about Paige. 5'6", dark hair, same jawline as my father's side of the family. 4 years younger than me, but people had mixed us up at family funerals for a decade. I thought about the text, "What size are your jeans?" and felt something cold settle under my ribs. Agent Reyes's team traced the document itself before they ever spoke to my family. A forged travel document that fools an exit control camera isn't made with a home printer. It takes access to real security stock or a very good counterfeit source, and either way it costs money and leaves a trail. A records request on Gary's bank account, part of the widening federal file, turned up a $4,000 cash withdrawal made 11 days before the flight at a branch 2 towns from where he worked, with no explanation attached. Agent Reyes told me later, once the case had closed, that the same withdrawal pattern had shown up before in 2 unrelated fraud cases her office had worked, tied to a document broker operating out of Queens who advertised, in code, as helping travelers who'd lost paperwork abroad, fast, no questions. He was arrested separately, on an unrelated federal charge, about 4 months after my case opened, and confirmed, once his own exposure was on the table, that he'd built a data page overlay using a photo Rita had emailed him and a scan of my real passport's information page. The same scan, it turned out, that my aunt had asked to borrow for insurance purposes almost a year earlier, back when she'd offered, so helpfully, to add me to my grandmother's travel insurance policy before a trip none of us ended up taking. I hadn't yet told Agent Reyes about the house in Porto. I didn't understand yet that the two things were the same thing. That evening, I called Dr. Marissa Silva, the Portuguese lawyer handling my grandmother's estate, mostly to ask when the notary signing was now scheduled, since I had missed the trip. She sounded confused by the question. "The signing already happened," she said. "You were there. Tuesday morning. You and your aunt both signed. I have the notarized deed transfer right here." I did not go to Porto on Tuesday morning. I was in Manhattan on Tuesday morning, filling out a lost passport report. I asked her to email me a copy of the signed document immediately. It arrived 20 minutes later. I opened it on my kitchen table with my hands not quite steady, which almost never happens to me, and I read every line the way I read everything, twice. There was my name, printed correctly. There was a signature next to it, and I want to be precise here, because precision is what eventually won this whole thing. It was close. It was close enough to fool a notary who had met me exactly once, 11 years earlier, at a family Christmas in Porto I barely remembered attending. But it wasn't mine. My signature has a small looping N and a flat final line under the whole name, a habit from years of signing customs forms fast. This signature's N had no loop at all, and underneath it, on the passport number line the notary had copied by hand, was my correct passport number, the real one, the one that was supposed to be in the zippered pocket of my bag at JFK. Someone had used my real passport number. That meant they hadn't just found a photo that looked like me. They had, somehow, gotten my actual passport, or a convincing copy of its data page, and put a different photo on it. I called Agent Reyes back that night with all of it, the text about jeans, the notary document, the mismatched signature, the timeline. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I have thought about many times since. Ems, called her. What you just described isn't a family misunderstanding. That's a forged federal travel document used to defraud a foreign notary. That's a crime on two continents. Over the next 10 days, with Agent Reyes's investigation running in parallel with my own, the picture assembled itself the way a shipping manifest does when you finally cross-reference every line against every other line, slowly, then all at once. The diplomatic security lab compared the facial recognition capture from JFK's exit control camera, the one that flagged the mismatch in the first place, against my real passport photo on file. They were not the same face. The bone structure was close. The hair was close. But the eyes sat differently. And machines built specifically to catch that difference had, this time, done their job. Agent Reyes explained that the exit control camera doesn't just take a photo. It runs a live match against the passport stored data in the seconds before the gate releases. And normally, that match is quiet, invisible. Nothing a traveler ever thinks about. It had done exactly what it was built to do that morning. It just hadn't been fast enough, or public enough, to stop the gate from opening before the flag reached a person who could act on it. The lab report used a phrase I will never forget: 94% confidence non-match. A 94% chance that whoever walked through that gate under my name was not me. Agent Reyes pulled the manifest for that flight next. 3 passengers under my family's last names had boarded. My mother, Ellen. My aunt, Rita. And a third passenger listed under my full legal name, Seat 14C. The same seat that had been printed on my own useless boarding pass. Because the airline system doesn't stop you from booking a duplicate seat under a name if you have the passport number to match it. There was a fourth name on that manifest too, a name I recognized immediately. Paige. Booked under her own passport in seat 22F at the back of the plane, far from where I was supposedly sitting. That seemed strange to me until Agent Reyes pointed out the obvious. Whoever wore my name onto that plane needed to sit apart from her own real identity the entire flight, so that no gate agent, no flight attendant, no fellow passenger would ever have a reason to look at 2 different boarding passes and one face at the same time. I thought about the car service Rita had arranged. I thought about splitting into 2 security lines. I thought about my passport disappearing from a zippered pocket during the 11 seconds it takes a bag to pass through an X-ray machine, in a line Rita had steered me into, standing 6 feet from a line she'd steered Paige into. I didn't have proof of the physical handoff yet, but I didn't need proof of everything at once. I only needed to keep pulling one document at a time, the way I'd been trained to for 9 years. The next thread came from Grant Foster, my appraiser, almost by accident. He called to check whether the sale had gone through. since his valuation report had been part of the file. When I told him it had, fraudulently, he asked a question that cracked the whole thing open. Did you know the buyer's local agent is related to your aunt? I did not know that. Grant had done more digging after our original appraisal, curious why Venduro's initial number had come in so precisely low. Low enough to look plausible, but not so low it would raise flags with someone who didn't check. The listing agent who had first brought Rita the offer was a man named Enrique Neves. Enrique Neves, it turned out, had gone to university with Rita's husband, Gary, 20 years earlier, and the two men had stayed close enough that Gary had been best man at Enrique's wedding. That alone wasn't a crime. What Agent Reyes's parallel financial subpoena eventually turned up was 3 days after the fraudulent notary signing, a company called Silverline Advisory Partners, a shell entity registered 11 weeks earlier, with Enrique Neves listed as the sole director, wired €140,000 into an account belonging to Rita, labeled in the transfer memo as a consulting fee. Rita had never consulted for anyone. The fee was a kickback, paid the moment the deed transferred, for delivering the property at $2.4 million instead of the nearly $4 million it was actually worth. Binduro Hospitality still paid full value for the site, just not to us. The difference had been quietly split between the developer's local fixer and my aunt, and the only obstacle standing between them and that money had been a 50% co-owner who kept asking for a second appraisal. That was the moment the whole shape of it stopped looking like a family squabble over sentiment and started looking like exactly what it was: a theft, built with paperwork instead of a crowbar. I hired my own attorney, a woman named Elena Cho, who specialized in cross-border estate disputes, and between her, Dr. Silva in Porto, and Agent Reyes's federal file, we built the case the way you build anything meant to hold weight, one confirmed document at a time. The bank wire, the lab's facial mismatch report, the forged signature comparison, done properly this time by a certified document examiner who put my genuine signature and the notary's signature side by side under magnification and wrote, in careful clinical language, that the loop formation and pen pressure were inconsistent with common authorship. Elena filed a formal challenge to the notarized deed transfer in Porto, citing document fraud and identity substitution. Under Portuguese law, a transfer signed by someone impersonating a legal owner is void from the moment it was signed, not voidable, void, as if it never happened. Dr. Silva, who had unknowingly notarized a fraud, was furious in the specific, professional way of someone whose own good name had just been used against them, and she filed her own complaint with the Regional Notary Oversight Board the same week, attaching the facial recognition report and the document examiner's signature comparison. She became one of our fastest allies, and told me once that in 22 years of practice, she had never had a signer's identity challenged this cleanly. Usually these cases come down to someone's word against someone else's, she said. Ours came down to a government camera, a laboratory, and a wire transfer with a paper trail. The Porto court process took 11 weeks from filing to ruling, slower than any of us wanted, and, Dr. Silva assured me, unusually fast for a fraud petition of this size. There was a hearing in March that I attended by video from my kitchen table at 6 in the morning to make the time difference work. Watching a judge in Porto page through the same folder I had built one document at a time: the notary deed, the mismatched signature, the exit control timestamp, the lab report, the wire transfer memo, and rule, without much ceremony, that the transfer was void and the property reverted to its owners of record. Rita and me, 50-50, exactly as my grandmother's will had always said. 2 weeks after the exit control flag first went off in that Manhattan passport office, I asked my mother to arrange a video call with Rita and Paige. I told her I had documents to share about the sale. I did not tell her which documents, or how many. Rita answered from what I recognized as my grandmother's own kitchen table. which told me she had already moved into planning the house as hers before it had even legally transferred. Paige sat beside her, not quite looking at the camera. My mother joined from her own apartment, 3 small rectangles on my screen, and I sat at my kitchen table with a folder in front of me the way I always sit with a folder in front of me. I want to talk about Tuesday, I said. The day I supposedly signed the deed transfer in Porto. Rita's face didn't move much. You know you missed the flight, Naomi. Dr. Silva said you signed remotely, through the embassy. There's no embassy remote signing process for a Portuguese property deed, I said. I checked. There isn't one. I never signed anything. Rita. Someone signed for me. I put the notary document on screen, my forged signature enlarged next to a sample of my real one from a mortgage form. I put up the facial recognition report, the 94% non-match. I put up the exit control timestamp from JFK, 10:50 that morning. The exact minute I had been kneeling on an airport floor emptying my bag onto a bench. The room on the other side of the screen went very quiet. My mother's hand came up over her mouth. And Paige, who had not said a word since the call started to cry. The ugly, involuntary kind, not the performance kind. I didn't want to, she said. Mom said it was just a formality. She said you'd have signed anyway if you weren't being difficult about the money, that we were just saving everyone a trip back later. She said it wasn't really lying if you would have said yes eventually. Paige, Rita said sharply. But it was too late. And I think some small honest part of Paige had been waiting weeks to say it out loud to someone who wasn't her mother. She had someone make a passport, Paige said. A guy Gary knew from before. Does IDs for people who lose theirs abroad, fast. He used your old passport photo from when you renewed 3 years ago. Mom had a copy from when she helped you with something once. I don't even remember what. And put my picture's proportions over it, close enough. I wore your green coat through the gate. I kept my head down. I was so scared the whole time. And then it worked, and everyone acted like it was fine, and I didn't know how to undo it after. Nobody said anything for a moment. On the screen, my mother was staring at Rita, not at me. And I understood in that silence that my mother had genuinely not known, that she had believed the remote signing story the same way I had briefly wanted to believe I'd simply misplaced a passport. There is one more document I haven't mentioned yet, because I didn't find it until after that call, and because it belongs at the end of this story, not the middle. Going through my grandmother's things with Dr. Silva to prepare the fraud petition, we found a sealed envelope in the drawer of her sewing table, my name written on the front in her handwriting. Inside was a short letter, dated 4 years before she died. The kind of letter you write when you're thinking clearly about what happens after you're gone and want to say it once, plainly, while you still can. She wrote that she knew Rita, and I saw the house differently, that Rita saw a number and I saw a kitchen table, and that she wasn't asking me to give up the number, only to make sure whatever happened to the house happened honestly, in the open, with everyone's name spelled correctly on the paper. A house built on a lie about who owns it isn't a home anymore, she wrote. It's just a debt someone hasn't collected yet. I read that line standing in Dr. Silva's office in Porto, holding a folder full of forged signatures, and I understood that my grandmother, in her own quiet way, had seen this coming years before any of us had. Rita tried, once, to hold the line. You would have signed eventually anyway, she said to me, her voice climbing. This is your grandmother's legacy, Naomi, and you turned it into a spreadsheet. Someone had to move this family forward. You moved 140,000 euros into your own account first, I said. That's not moving the family forward. That's moving money to yourself and calling it my sister's inheritance so it would sound better. I hadn't said that detail out loud before that call. I watched her understand, in real time, that I already had the wire transferred too. The Enduro Hospitality. Once its own legal team learned their local agent had orchestrated a kickback and the transfer he delivered was fraudulent. withdrew from the deal entirely rather than risk their name attached to a Portuguese fraud case. Enrique Neves lost his position and is, as of this year, still facing a separate criminal referral in Portugal over the shell company payment. Agent Reyes's federal case resulted in Rita being charged in the United States with conspiracy related to fraudulent use of a passport and aggravated identity theft. A passport applied for and used to defraud a government agency abroad still false, it turns out, well within federal jurisdiction. Because the document itself is a United States travel document and the identity stolen was mine. She pleaded to a reduced set of charges rather than go to trial, given how complete the paper trail was, and paid restitution that included returning the full €140,000, plus penalties. Gary was never criminally charged himself. The cash withdrawal alone wasn't enough on its own to prove intent, and he maintained he'd simply lent his wife money for trip expenses. But he lost the small accounting practice he ran out of their house within the year. Once local clients heard what had happened, my grandmother used to say that a reputation in a small enough world is really just a kind of currency. And currency. Once people stop trusting it, stop spending. Paige, 26 years old, and, in the end, more used than malicious, cooperated fully once the evidence made denial pointless. Her own attorney negotiated a deferred prosecution agreement. No conviction if she completed probation and stayed clean for 2 years, which, as far as I know, she has. She sent me a letter of her own, months later, careful and a little raw, admitting she'd known exactly what she was doing at that gate even if she hadn't understood what it would become. I haven't fully answered it yet. Some apologies you believe right away. Others you just let sit on the counter for a while before you decide what to do with them. My mother and I are still speaking, though carefully now. The way you speak after you've learned someone you trusted can be persuaded past their better judgment when the story sounds sympathetic enough. She has told me more than once that she didn't ask enough questions about the remote signing, and that not asking was its own kind of choice. I believe she means it. She called me on the anniversary of my father's death this year, which she hadn't done in a few years, and we talked for an hour about nothing important, and it felt like something small being rebuilt rather than something large being repaired. I haven't decided yet how much that changes between us. Some doors you can leave cracked open without walking all the way back through them, and I've learned that's allowed. You don't owe anyone a fully open door just because they're family. I keep thinking about something Agent Reyes said to me on our last call after the federal case closed. She told me most of the identity fraud cases she works never get solved because the victim never notices in time, or notices and can't prove it, or simply doesn't have the habit of keeping records that would let them prove anything at all. You notice in about 4 hours, she said. Most people don't notice in 4 years. I told her it wasn't luck. It was just the same thing I'd been doing my whole life without anyone ever thanking me for it. Reading the page in front of me instead of the page I wanted it to say. As for the house, the blue house on the hill above the Douro, with the terrace where I learned to knead bread and argue about fish prices, it's still standing. Mine and Rita's, on paper at first, the way that we'll always intend it. Though Rita and I have not spoken since a mediated call where I made clear I had no interest in taking her share, only in stopping her from taking mine through fraud. 6 months after the ruling, I bought her out at the fair value Grant Foster's report established, using savings I had built the same slow way my grandmother built her tailoring business, one careful year at a time. It is fully mine now. Theo and I flew there together last spring, with real, unstolen passports, checked twice, the way I check everything, and stood on that terrace at the hour when the light comes off the river gold. The same hour my grandmother used to call the good hour, when the fishing boats come in, and the whole hillside smells like bread from 3 kitchens at once. I found her old folder in the closet, the one with 60 years of deeds and tax receipts, and I added my own documents to it, the court ruling, the appraisal, the letter she'd left me, because I understood, standing there, that the house had never really been the thing my family fought over. The house was just where the truth happened to be filed, the same way it always had been, for 3 generations of women who kept their own paperwork because nobody else was going to keep it for them. People ask me sometimes if I regret hiring a second appraiser. Regret being, as Rita put it, difficult. I don't. A family that needs you to stop checking the paperwork in order to keep loving you was never asking for trust. It was asking for permission. If your family has ever tried to move faster than you were willing to sign, if you've ever felt that cold, quiet certainty that something didn't add up and been told you were the problem for noticing you weren't, the paper always tells the truth eventually. You just have to be the one who keeps reading it twice. Tell me in the comments if you've ever caught a lie because you simply refuse to stop checking. Share this with the person in your life who reads every document before they sign it. They'll know exactly why it mattered. And subscribe to Quiet Proof Stories, where the ones who kept the file always end up holding the truth.